Jeremy, wonderful to have you on. As always, phenomenal work so far. I heard you on your old stomping grounds earlier in the morning at Democracy Now! Talking about what you're going to be talking about right now, the Memorandum of Understanding, or rather, a Memorandum of Understanding to sign the Memorandum of Understanding, which will unlock a 60-day ceasefire period between Iran, the United States of America, and maybe with Israel as well. There's a lot of naysayers. I'm very critical of this deal, but I wanted to hear your perspective as someone who is, as a brilliant investigative reporter, goes and talks to the people on the other side. So let's begin.
Yeah, I'll just back up a little bit. Last night, I was in touch with an Iranian source and was asking, what the response was going to look like to the fact that the Israelis had bombed, Dahia, the southern suburb of Beirut, and the Iranians had said some weeks ago, and then they followed through on it, that if Netanyahu and the Israelis started attacking Beirut, that Iran was going to respond. And it was a significant sort of turning point in this process because the Israelis had consistently violated the terms of the April agreement that J.D. Vance brokered in Islamabad with the Iranians. The Lebanon was supposed to have a ceasefire as part of the original agreement that the Trump administration made with the Iranians that was meant to then open up the space to negotiate a deal that then started to be referred to as an initial memorandum of understanding. And then Trump and Netanyahu tried to carve out this alternative path where they started working with the president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, and they created their own kind of fraudulent so-called peace process. The stated intent of it from the Israeli and American side was to try to enlist the Lebanese government as their kind of domestic troops against Hezbollah. And in fact, the president of Lebanon, 2 weeks ago, or a little bit less than 2 weeks ago, actually issued a public statement when the Iranians were demanding that the ceasefire apply to Lebanon, basically telling the Iranians to stay out of Lebanon's business, which then got him criticized by a lot of people within Lebanon itself. But the Iranians had stopped short of taking military action against those ceasefire violations, even though they felt that they would have been justified. But then when Netanyahu started pushing his forces, Israel's forces north of the Litani River, occupying more swaths of Lebanese land, killing more Lebanese civilians, and then threatening to bomb Beirut, the Iranians said, if you do that, we're going to come in and respond to that. And that happened. And I think that took a lot of people by surprise because this was a rather extraordinary moment. In the middle of these high-stakes negotiations with the Americans, the Iranians struck back against Israel, not for bombing Iran, but for bombing Lebanon. And I think for a lot of people, that was sending a message that Iran really meant it when they said that this was a red line. And so Trump also had said this wasn't going to happen again. So when it did happen yesterday, the Iranians were saying, we're going to respond. And I was about to go with a story based on what I was hearing from Iranian officials that they were going to strike. At one point, I was told the strikes were going to begin within 1 hour. And so as I was preparing that post, I was going back and I was saying, so you're certain that this is happening? Yes, we're certain that this is happening. And then I got a message, wait, hold up a second, something has happened. I turn on Jazeera and I see Donald Trump is saying, oh, there's going to be an imminent deal. And then while I'm talking with the Iranian official, the Pakistani prime minister posts on Twitter that the two sides have agreed to this deal. Now, what I heard immediately after that was that it was a unilateral announcement. And so the Iranians, and by the way, there were Qatari officials in Tehran at this moment. One of the background stories here is that Qatar really took over the prime position of mediator behind the scenes, in part because the Pakistanis were really unable to kind of seal the deal. I mean, it's a real thing. And Qatar has a complicated relationship with Trump. There's financial interwoven interests with Jared Kushner. There was the long history with the Gaza deal. And so the Qataris have really been the closers of this. And the Iranians speak in a much more kind of respectful. It's not that they're disrespecting the Pakistanis, but they speak in a more serious way about the Qataris, and felt that they were better assessors of what Trump was actually willing to do and what he wasn't willing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so once that announcement was made, there was a flurry of discussions with the mediators, and they were all begging Iran not to strike Israel. And the Iranians, I'm told, then said, okay, there's a couple of outstanding issues here that were not resolved before you guys made this announcement. So if you want this thing to stick, you're going to have to meet us where we've stated. So the Iranian narrative on this, and again, we haven't seen the text of this memorandum of understanding, and it could actually crumble because of that, because Trump is saying one thing. He's saying it has certain conditions in it. The Iranians are saying something different. But what I understand is that the Iranians did feel that they got concessions that they wouldn't have gotten had Netanyahu not done that strike, and the Iranians not decided to say, okay, we're not going to retaliate against them right now. The Iranian narrative on this is that they got Trump to agree to a much swifter lifting of the military blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. That they were able to get Trump to agree to some sort of conditions on financial aspect of this. Again, we haven't seen the text yet. So, and it's hard, there's different interests also. When you talk about Iranian media, it's not a monolith. You have different media outlets that are close to different entities within Iran. And in fact, at one point, the state broadcaster of Iran today, IRIB, actually posted on Twitter, there are only 2 state news agencies in Iran, because they were kind of clarifying that there was a lot of misinformation where people were saying state-affiliated news agency about news agencies that aren't. But what we understand is that the Iranians felt that they had gotten substantial enough concessions that they didn't go forward then with striking Israel. There are conflicting reports, and this is really to put a fine point on it. I believe that Lebanon is going to be the key to whether or not any actual short-term or medium-term deal happens, because Netanyahu and his defense minister both came out today and said we're remaining entrenched where we are inside of Lebanon, and that Trump is making a deal with Iran, but we're our own entity and we have a right to set our own policy. So they're saying they're not going to withdraw. Some Iranian sources have indicated that Trump said he would get the Israelis to withdraw. Other Iranian sources that I think are actually more likely giving a realistic assessment is that there's some language about the sovereignty and unity of Lebanon, and some provision that states that Iran has a right to self-defense. And the Iranians, I think, would define violating the ceasefire, continuing to attack Lebanon under that umbrella. So that's a point that could raise some contention. But clearly, the Israelis want to try to sabotage this before it even gets going. I would say in the big picture, Hasan, that Trump made some massive capitulations here. I don't think there's any way to other way to slice it.
Yeah.
He's sitting there in France with Macron, a short time before you and I started talking, and he's saying the most important thing is Iran is saying that they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. Well, not only has that been policy of Iran for a couple of decades, but if you go back and read the preamble to the 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal negotiated under Obama, in the preamble to that agreement, Iran says the exact same thing that Trump is celebrating as a victory right now, which is that Iran agrees not just to not develop a nuclear weapon, but to pursue or acquire one in any form. That was already in the deal. Trump is saying, oh, and the Strait of Hormuz is going to be opened, and look at how oil is coming back down, and it's going to take some days, but we're gonna get that strait opened up. Well, the Strait of Hormuz was open before this thing happened. Yeah. The other thing, and I think perhaps most significant in terms of the capitulation narrative, is that if you go back and look at what the Iranians were telling me and other journalists, and at times what they were even saying publicly before the war started, Iran was entering those negotiations with the Trump's Gulf buddies. I started saying that like the Iranians sent people with PhDs to the negotiations, and Trump sends people with last week's golf scores, to the negotiations. But the Iranians were there willing to put a lot of things on the table. And right now, what's not being discussed is Iran's ballistic missile program. Yeah. Right now, the Iranians are saying that they're open to a dilution of the highly enriched uranium that is above 60%, but that it's going to happen within Iran. And Trump himself has now started indicating that that's what he is willing to accept. But to be clear, The nuclear issue has nothing to do with this first memorandum of understanding. The memorandum of understanding covers the Strait of Hormuz, a cessation of the hostilities, and then an initial unlocking of frozen Iranian assets. Trump and JD Vance have kind of shifted how they talk about this now. I had been told 2 or 3 days ago by an Iranian official that it was unlikely that Trump was going to announce or publicly own any unfreezing of assets at the front end of this deal because he has been bashing Obama for it.
Yeah.
JD Vance today indicated that there may be some of that happening. Without question, money is going to Iran if it hasn't already.
Well,
the question
has,
is,
right?
how's it going to be spun?
We already know that
there are these reports about the Emiratis.
Yeah. That's what I was pointing to. Yeah.
Yeah.
$3 billion to some total of, I believe, $20 billion has been reported. And the $3 billion is already actually flown into Iran directly from the UAE is the initial reporting on this.
The Emiratis are denying this, and it may or may not be true that it's $3 billion or that it's the Emiratis, but I don't have any doubt that billions of dollars are going to be going to Iran as a result of this agreement. And I suspect that some already started flowing to them even before this. So the Iranians would also point to any shift that we see in that posture as a result of last night's kind of 11th hour decision not to strike Israel. So the Iranian narrative is that they were able to get more concessions out of Trump. On the bigger picture, though, and in some ways this is more important, I mentioned Lebanon. What I'm hearing from Iran is they don't have any faith that this is going to result in an actual long-term deal. I do think they genuinely would like to make a deal. I think Iran wants comprehensive sanctions relief. That would be the big prize of any nuclear negotiation with the United States. They just simply don't trust Donald Trump, and they certainly don't trust Netanyahu. And what they're saying is, in the medium term, we assess that Trump and Netanyahu are going to try to decouple Iran and Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance.
Yeah.
And the Iranian and Hezbollah strategy is we're going to try to decouple Israel from the United States in terms of the next front of this war. Israel, without a doubt, is going to intensify its covert actions inside of Iran. Israel is going to try to destabilize the Iranian state. Israel wants to recreate a more intense, larger scale version of the violent episodes that we saw in January of 2026. There's no question about that. But right now, there's internal debate within Iran. Some fairly prominent political forces in Iran were very much against this deal. There were protests against Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, against Mohammed Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament and the lead negotiator, at times even calling, in quite violent ways for them to be removed from the process. But in general, Iran, I believe, is a nation of institutions and structure, and I don't believe that the Iranians would go forward with this deal unless there was buy-in and approval at the highest levels of political, military, and religious power in the country.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have, and I think this is a question on everybody's minds, is what kind of assurances could America have possibly given to Iran, and whether or not Iran basically took the additional concessions that Trump may have made in the last hour, opening up the Strait of Hormuz and removing the blockade that the Americans had in the Strait of Hormuz, not over the course of 30 days, but instantly, as Trump seemingly has been on board with now, and potentially the unfreezing of billions of dollars of assets. Is this basically a bribe for Iran to release their conditions on Lebanon, or is this a real commitment from Donald Trump that he will restrain Israel? Because as you and I have discussed in the past as well, that is the primary focus for long-term stability for Iran. Obviously, sanctions relief is the most consequential one for the Iranian economy to no longer suffer, and that volatility is what actually aids Israel's campaigns inside of Iran to foment some kind of counter-revolution, to foment some kind of instability, and whip up the masses into taking arms against the state potentially. Yeah. But outside of that, I think that Iran understands that this is an existential crisis, and therefore their primary focus here is to get America to restrain Israel. Like, it's not necessarily, from my estimations, and I might be wrong on this. I don't like. There are people who obviously care about Gaza inside of Iran, inside of the Iranian leadership. There are obviously people who care about the Lebanese population there as well. But their calculation almost seems very pragmatic, where they're looking at if this is a game of proxies and there are different players involved, then they cannot allow Israel to continue behaving in this belligerent manner. Their entire ballistic munitions program is dedicated to ensuring that Israel cannot encroach on other countries in the ways that it has. So the best possible way to restrain Israel is by going to the United States of America and demanding this. Do you feel like they've like what is your read on this? Has America given anything to Iran that shows that this is a real restraint upon Israel is going to happen here? Because Israel is still continuously saying they're going to continue pummeling Lebanon.
As we speak right now, it's there is an interesting track of leverage that the Iranians remain firmly in control of, and that is that when they successfully broke the negotiations into two parts. Remember, Trump at the beginning was demanding that he was saying that the American military is going to go into Iran and retrieve the nuclear dust. He was saying it has to be a total surrender. He wanted all of this stuff to be part of whatever deal was going to be signed. That had to do with the nuclear issue, that had to do with ballistic missile range, that had to do with support for regional allies of Iran. None of that stuff is in this first part of the deal with any substance. So and this was an Iranian plan. The Iranians were the ones that said this needs to be divided into two. The answer to your question in the short term right now, looking at this MOU, Hasan, is that the Iranians do not want the ability of the United States to pull back any of its commitments. And so they are making the phased process, the kind of sequencing of this, such that if the United States doesn't fulfill its obligations, it doesn't release Iranian funds, Netanyahu then resumes a large-scale attack on Beirut. The United States keeps military assets in the region. The United States continues some form of a military blockade, or they engage in some chicanery in the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian position is then we can counteract that and we can stop the process there. That may be it may be overstating Iran's ability, because Iran has to take into account its relationship with other countries and the fact that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is also damaging the economy, the agricultural sector, the basic livelihood of many countries around the world that are friends of Iran. So the stakes for Iran of resuming this after we open the thing up, after things start to get normalized, would be high, and the narrative would be slightly different. But Iran has built this in. That's not something that existed in the JCPOA. Iran had very limited ability to fight back against U.S. breaking of commitments. So what I'm told by Iranians is we built this in a structured way so that we have an ability to enforce the agreement, not just the American side. Once you get into the issue, and by the way, one of Iran's biggest problems right now is liquidity. Iran doesn't have cash. And it's not that Iran doesn't have resources or that Iran hasn't created a war economy. It has. But the cash flow situation is real, which is part of why they want the assets to be unfrozen at the front of this, why they want to be able to have some of these oil sanctions lifted at the front end, which I'm told the Iranians are getting out of Trump right now. But as we move then into that next phase, the Iranians now have to start asking, what leverage do we have as Trump starts focusing on the highly enriched uranium? The fear, I think, would be that the thing stretches on. Netanyahu starts getting away with it. Trump comes up with some new concocted narrative about it. And the Iranians then have to say, are we willing to now resume bombing Israel because of what they're doing in Lebanon? Are we willing to reimpose a kind of shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, or the attempt to limit any ships that are in any way affiliated with the United States or its allies? I don't think Iran's Arab neighbors want this thing to resume. The big story of this later is going to be, this has really transformed that region in a way that I don't think the neocons envisioned. I think the tone is shifting quite dramatically against Israel. And the concern of the Iranians that were really critical of this deal was that Iran has never had and may never again have more leverage than it has right now, and they feel that that this is still not enough protection to make a comprehensive deal, particularly with an erratic liar like Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's why I was bringing it up, because I feel like there's gimmies on both sides, right? For the American side, I think unfreezing of assets, especially through a more opaque funding structure, like by way of regional partners, is probably the easiest concession that the Americans can offer to the Iranians. And then on the Iranian side, given that they have already made prior concessions on the nuclear program, that has always felt like, to me, the gimme on the Iranian side for the Americans, to make the Americans look like they're actually, winning something here, despite the unfathomable amount of leverage that they've been able to fight for and successfully win in this process.
And you brought up Gaza too.
Yeah,
I was Gaza, and I think, you've talked about this. I think it's actually worth talking a little bit about it. I asked Iranian officials about this, and I was saying earlier today on Amy's show that the answer on the Gaza, the Gaza question is not. I haven't found it a satisfying answer. I understand the logic of the Iranians, but I basically said, why aren't you making a bigger focus on Gaza? Israel. Here's a statistic that's worth repeating. Israel has killed more Palestinians since the October 2025 ceasefire, has killed more Palestinians since that ceasefire was signed than Hamas and the other resistance groups killed Israeli civilians on October 7th.
Yeah.
Just in this period since the ceasefire.
Yeah.
The Israelis are violating every single day, every component of the ceasefire.
Yeah.
And so, when we say the Iranians at one point did start saying, all regional actors,
including Syria as well, right? They were demanding
all theaters, yeah.
Yeah.
And Iraq in particular. So, but the Iranian answer on this is that is twofold. One is there already is a process that the Palestinian leadership has agreed to participate in, these negotiations with this so-called Board of Peace. There is a United Nations Security Council resolution. The Palestinian delegation, as we speak, remains in Cairo, where it just delivered a response to a proposal on how to move forward addressing Israel's violations of phase one of the ceasefire deal, and they're demanding that Hamas disarm, and there's a whole process. So they're saying the Palestinians have this process. And by the way, Iran is in touch with the Palestinian leadership. There was a call between Abbas Araghchi and Khalil al-Hayya, the lead negotiator for Hamas recently. Hamas has a representative to Iran. There are warm, as they would say, brotherly relations between the two. But Hamas never has had the type of relationship with Iran that Hezbollah did. This is a media concocted story. The idea that Iran was the sort of mastermind behind October 7th is pure lies. It's a complete and total lie. The Palestinians are a national liberation movement, and they are overwhelmingly funded and fueled by their own ingenuity and an assortment of their allies. It's not that Iran isn't an ally of the Palestinian resistance. Of course it is. But Hezbollah and Iran have a much deeper partnership that Hassan Nasrallah himself openly spoke about, that the Iranians openly speak about. It was Hezbollah that decided to join the front when the United States and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th. A couple of days later, Hezbollah fully joined the front. Hamas has not fired a single rocket at Israel since the ceasefire. So what the Iranians are saying is the conditions are different. And what they'll say in their defense, and they don't take a defensive tone, they're saying that on a strategic level, their view is if they don't defend the Lebanese front, that if they don't prevent the Israelis from running the deck, that this is going to have a catastrophic impact on the Palestinians, because the only real force that stood up after October 7th alongside the Palestinians was Hezbollah. This is their closest ally directly next to them. So Iran's argument would be, if we lose this, and if we somehow were to abandon Hezbollah, it would also be an abandonment of the Palestinians. And we're trying to approach this in a strategic way, but we have not forgotten about Gaza. That's their position on